The title of my presentation is Our Water Future, Groundwater, and Exportation Issues. But I really thought about taking just a minute and think about Rio Grande's state of the basin. So kind of tap danced all around it this morning, and really how do you characterize what is the state of the basin today? Some of Craig's graphs, and I actually will redisplay some of those, but you should have gathered an appreciation for the high variability of the water supply in this basin. So we go from times of real prosperity to some times when supplies are really diminishing and really challenging. And so I would characterize the state of the basin today as we're in that period of challenging, complicated, but also hopeful. What Ken and Phil had talked about, the level of collaboration that exists here is really rather extraordinary. So given that we're in this period, the state of the basin being challenged and difficult and complicated, the level of collaboration seems to continue to go up to offer a ray of hope or a recognition that, you know, we can work this out. So if I'm going to talk about the future of groundwater, it's actually really important to do a little bit of talk about the past and the present as well. And again, a number of times today people have reflected or talked about that connection between groundwater and surface water. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history as it pertains to surface water. So if I run this thing right. So this is really a similar graph to what Craig displayed this morning, but I added a little bit of more context to it. So this is the flow of the Rio Grande as it's gauged at Del Norte, and there's really two stories to tell here. Similar to what Craig did, this is the application or the decreed appropriations of diversions out of the Rio Grande River, which is water district number 20, over a period of time. So the first ones occurred on the Rio Grande, the Silva Ditch in 1866. And much like Craig was pointing out, by the 1900s, if you owned a water right decreed in 1893, it says you're available to divert water during the irrigation season if the river is flowing at that level, at that 5,000 CFS. So in combination what Craig had done, so his was represented as a blue line. We've also put in the flow of the Rio Grande at Del Norte for 2 years. 2005 was a better than average year, so he had average on there. So 2005 was a better than average year. 2010 was a below average year. So what we're trying to highlight, and this is not an absolute, this is for illustrative purposes only, because there are a handful of diversions above the gauging station at Del Norte that wouldn't be captured here. There are return flows below the gauging station along the system that would make water available for diversion that aren't represented here. And then Craig did, I thought, a nice job of reflecting, even though this is the gauged flow, I assure you in 2005, there was a curtailment on the Rio Grande that would have said a portion of that water, that would have been Craig's red line, said it's not available. So what I was trying to highlight and try to show and make a connection is that the flow of the Rio Grande and the Conejos and really all the systems here have a correlation to groundwater in our future. I think Ken maybe touched on it, but certainly with it, throughout the valley, it's been argued and engineered and studied, and a recognition that our confined aquifer system, our unconfined aquifer system, and the surface water systems are connected to some degree, to some capacity throughout the valley. So what happens in our surface water system is important to the groundwater. But I'll also highlight there's an indirect as well. I own a farm, my dad and my grandparents, I own a farm that has surface water rights, kind of junior, middle of the road priorities, and then I own a confined aquifer well too. So I operate my farm and says, when my priority comes into play, and it's about an 1886. So it's available from about May on to about sometimes late July or August. So as long as I have my surface water supply, and it's Commonwealth water, it's the Empire Canal, as long as that water's in priority, I can have an adequate supply to my farm. As soon as the Commonwealth goes off, in June or late July, sometimes on a rare occasion into August. Then I use my well, my confined aquifer well. So that's why the future of groundwater is kind of, well, it's not kind of, it's tied to what happens to our surface water systems. So I already screwed the dramatic effect up by jumping ahead one slide when I didn't mean to, because what happens to producers that, you know, you had an 1890 decree that in 2005, you only had water from late May to late June. What happened in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s with the build out of an electrical distribution system and really the technology, the vertical turbine pump, guess what? We started drilling wells. So there were small capacity, really stock wells on record all the way back to the turn of the century and before, but not an abundance of them and not for irrigation purposes. So in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, we start drilling wells into our unconfined and confined aquifer systems. So this was a representation of how over-appropriated the river is. So there are appropriations beyond 1910, but really by 1900, most of the flow of the river was appropriated. So what do? We drill wells. So this is a visual reflection of all the decreed wells in the basin. Now keep in mind, every one of those don't exist, but I assure you there's a predominance of them that do. But it just highlights how, again, over-appropriated, the last slide was a reflection of how over-appropriated the surface water systems are. This is not quantifiable, but at least a visual representation of how over-appropriated the groundwater system is. And if you left out of here today with no message other than an understanding and appreciation that we live and operate in a highly over-appropriated basin, but also that we are working collaboratively to manage that and to improve our position and really come to terms with how do you match supply with demand. So we've applied for and drilled numerous wells into both the confined and unconfined systems. And look, it'll come up again a little later, but generally the unconfined wells reside in predominantly what's now referred to commonly as Subdistrict 1 or the closed basin. So an abundance of these outside of that closed basin are confined aquifer wells, but not all of them. And there are confined wells within the unconfined system as well. A number of people have seen this slide routinely. So NOAA does this for us on a bi-weekly basis. I just wanted to highlight the conditions, and taking Julie's comments into account, they still call it as drought. But this slide hasn't really changed much, particularly over the last 16 months, but really for the last 20 years. There's not been a huge significant change. We might have moved from moderate drought to severe or from extreme to severe. A little celebration because last year the whole Sangre de Cristo range over here was in exceptional drought. So from the end of the year till now, there's been a slight improvement. But keep that graphic in mind. You can remove the drought moniker from it, and that's just the aridification of the West and the San Luis Valley in particular. So Craig had this same graph, but I did want to highlight a couple of other special items of note. So again, this is a histogram of the flows of the Rio Grande at Del Norte on an annual basis. And again, we've been measuring it since 1890. The blue line is the long-term average, so historically it's been on this decline. What I like to point out in reference to, and again, this will tie eventually to the future of groundwater here, is the Rio Grande River now has a 10-year period that we didn't. This is a 700,000 acre foot year. We now have a 10-year period that the Rio Grande hasn't flown 700,000 acre feet. Hopeful this year we'll actually break that, and I can talk about something different. But we don't have a single decade in our history that the river didn't flow at least a single year of 700,000 acre feet, and usually multiple years. But even for me, something more important that I note, look at the 800,000 acre mark. So this is a really big year on the Rio Grande. We're now about to approach 20 years where we don't have an 800,000 acre foot river. Again, there's not a decade in our history, so this 60s had only a single year, but outside of that, every decade has 2, 3, or 4 or more years where the Rio Grande was flowing 800,000 acre feet. That's how we built an abundance of our aquifer systems, both the confined and the unconfined, over these big flows over history. So that's a bit of a challenge for us going forward. Craig touched on it. 2018 was the fourth worst recorded flow in our history. So now over the last 20 years, we have 2 years, 2 of the worst years in 20 years. The prior 110 years, there's only 2 more years like that. So pretty challenging. This is the Conneas, and exactly the same thing. Long-term trend, they don't have the records back as far as the Rio Grande does, but you can see the diminishing supply. Once again, pick this 300,000 acre foot river. We're now 20 plus years without a 300,000 acre foot river. And you can go again, the 70s here was only 1 year above 300. But again, progressively over time, at least every decade, we have a really good flow as measured as a 300,000 acre foot river on the Conneas system. Again, to kind of now focus on present conditions, the graph Craig showed this morning about the change in the unconfined aquifer, that's what I'll talk about, but I also wanted to show how that graph is created or what it represents. So it represents this study area that Alan Davey and Davis Engineering have done for the Rio Grande Water Conservation District since 1976. So it's a series of 29 wells. The total acreage under the shaded area is about 300,000 acres. Subdistrict 1 resides predominantly inside of that and at about 175 to 200,000 acres. So Alamosa, Monte Vista, Moffett, that's the study area that graph represents. So you saw this morning. Average change since 1976, not the average, the absolute change in the unconfined aquifer month by month. So I have an employee that goes and measures those 29 wells, gives the information to Alan, and he measures the change in the aquifer in that study area every month since 1976. We rock along till the year 2002, pretty stable, some ups and downs. And the general consensus is that up until this time in 2002, all of the wells inside Subdistrict 1 had an adequate supply of water. In 2002, we have the worst drought in our recorded history. The aquifer loses 400,000 acre feet in 1 year. That triggers a couple of things. We've talked about subdistricts. 2002 was really the initial emphasis for the Rio Grande Water Conservation District taking some steps to go, given this precipitous decline, realizing there is an impact there's a relationship between groundwater withdrawals and surface water systems. The state didn't know exactly what that connection or impacts were yet. And this precipitous decline said, we need a solution quickly. So with the help of our attorney, David Robbins, and the vision of my board back in 2002 and up to 2004, working with the state legislature, there was a document crafted and legislation passed that we continually refer to as Senate Bill 222. So Senate Bill 222 passed in 2004 that really said producers would have to come together. 10 minutes? Oh, I'm gonna have to speed up. 2002 or 2004, the bill came together that said we have to come together as communities of interest, or we could come together as communities of interest and create these sub-districts, and you have to do 2 things. You have to replace or mitigate the injurious depletions that your wells cause to the senior surface water rights, and you have to work to create and maintain a sustainable aquifer. The first group jumps out there and does this in earnest. Subdistrict 1, 3,000 wells, 300 constituents come together, agree to assess themselves to work. They get a decree that says they have to move this red line, which is a 5-year rolling average of the change. So they come together in '04, get approved in '06 and '07. Some court battles about their operations or their plan of water management. But the plan says you have to move this red line from here up to at least minus 400,000 acre feet. And you have 20 years to do that. Keep in mind, 2012 is their first year of operation. 2012 was another pretty bad year. You see a decline. The aquifer hits what had better be its lowest point, 2013. The sub-district's making pretty good progress. Last year hits, we lose, as Craig pointed out, we lose 200,000 acre feet. So the community should understand the implications of that. The decree says you have to fix this, and you have 20 years to do it. So we're 7 years into this process. We take a really significant decline or impact in Subdistrict 1 last year. You might have seen in the Valley Courier, the state engineer writes a letter, says he's concerned. His job is to administer that decree. If at any point it becomes undeniable that the sub-district can't move that line up to the minus 400,000 acre feet, in the time remaining under the decree, he's under an obligation to not approve their annual replacement plan, which means those wells don't operate for the year. That puts, again, 160 some thousand irrigated acres, highly productive farm ground at risk, and a carry-on impact to the community. So Subdistrict 1 is working hard to come up with solutions to move that red line in the time slot that they have left. The other piece of the legislation said confined aquifer systems. You have to recover the pressure in the confined aquifer systems back to what existed from 1978 to 2000. On our website, you can access this map through it's just a well information tab, and these are a series of confined aquifer wells that either the district has been measuring or in conjunction with the USGS have been measuring, usually about mid-80s forward. So I just use this as a reference. I came in and picked Con 1, which is in Conneaus County. It's just east of Capuline. This is the Capuline Highway and the Gun Barrel. And you can go online, and there's a hydrograph of the measured change of the water table in Con 1 since back in the 80s. And you can see fairly stable through the 80s. 2002, you start to see this decline, and this is where these are the readings from this year. So back here, the depth to the level of the water in Con 1 ranged from about 40 feet down to about 50 feet, sometimes down to 60. In 2018, it dropped as low as 85 feet. And actually, its highest level in 18 was about 50 feet. So that's what producers in the community that came together to form these sub-districts have to fix this problem. Challenging how you're going to fix it, but they're under an obligation to fix it. Enough of the bad news, a little bit of good news, or less challenging news. And Craig or somebody mentioned, to check this morning, this is actually up to 118%. Or no, Travis, somebody mentioned it's up to 120% now. So this was as of Thursday. This is the same graph Craig showed, but I'd just highlight where we're at. Oh, this is one Craig mentioned. We're up now higher than that. So a little bit of good news. The other bit of good news, Craig touched on a little bit. We now have come together and created, again, Subdistrict 1 is in its 7th year of operation, replacing its injurious depletions, working to recover its aquifer. Subdistrict 2 and Subdistrict 3 will submit their first annual replacement plans by April the 15th. They will be operational this year if the state accepts those plans. That'll put over 200,000 groundwater irrigated acres into operation to replace their injurious depletions and work to create and maintain a sustainable aquifer. Good news. Subdistrict 4, 5, and 6 are all formed and should be at this same stage next year, ready to submit their first annual replacement plans to the state. That'll put all groundwater irrigated acres under the Rio Grande Water Conservation District into a pattern of and an expectation of replacing their injurious depletions and working to recover their aquifer systems. Trinchera operates a little differently. They're not under the Rio Grande Water Conservation District, but they do have a sub-district. The Costilla Plain is treated a little differently in rules right now. The state isn't confident in being able to predict groundwater movement and the impacts to surface water systems from groundwater withdrawals on the Castilla Plain yet. So a little bit of challenge left there. This is why I do this. This is my son, appropriately in his Adams State cut-off sleeveless shirt. And I'm proud to be the 4th generation of my family to farm and ranch here, and my 27-year-old son would like to carry on. And the only way we're going to be able to carry on is if we work together as a community to help resolve this problem we're facing, unscramble the egg that we've scrambled, and again, come back to a position of sustainability where our demand matches our supply. So he lives here and helps me and my dad, and would like him to be the 5th generation of my family to carry on this farming tradition. Lastly, there's been some discussion about this. This is just a borrowed screenshot from Renewable Water Resources webpage. Just a quick bit of history. So representatives from Renewable Water Resources approached the Rio Grande Water Conservation District late last year with a proposal that says, well, they outlined what their vision was and a proposal to the district. So their proposal, or let me say, the outline of their vision was, again, they had acquired some property in Saguache County in the north end of the valley. They were proposing to drill a series of 30-something confined aquifer wells, pump 22,000 acre feet out of the confined aquifer, deliver it over Poncha Pass and eventually into the South Platte Basin. The proposal was ask the Rio Grande Water Conservation District to partner with them to manage a $60 million fund on their behalf to acquire and retire water rights across the valley. The district, I would hope, as most everybody would expect, the district adamantly refused that proposal and adopted a resolution, again, reaffirming our long-standing tradition and history. The district would not support this project and would adamantly and vigorously oppose it going forward. So I will say the San Luis Valley Water Conservancy District and the Conejos Water Conservancy District have taken the same formal action in opposition to the proposal. This is just another screenshot from the page that I just wanted to highlight. And Ken and Phil really did a good job of talking about the project created by the people of San Luis Valley benefits everyone, protects our environment, and brings needed resources to our community. We would challenge that's not accurate from our position. But I wanted to highlight the first dot here. The San Luis Valley has a pressing legal obligation to retire stream flows and unconfined wells. That's a false statement. There is no legal obligation for us to retire stream flows. There is no legal obligation for us to retire unconfined aquifer wells. Subdistrict 1 has a decree to recover their aquifer. They can do it through a number of mechanisms. Water conservation efforts, dropping corner irrigation systems off of their center pivot sprinklers, different crop varieties, temporary fallowing. They've done a number of things to try to improve their aquifer conditions, but there is no mandate to retire unconfined aquifer wells. Saguache County has a pressing community needs and limited resources to fund them. I would let Saguache County address that when the time's right, but I would challenge that statement as well. Because the other part of their proposal was a $50 million community fund to assist the community. So I'm probably out of time. You're good. I'm good. And look, the last thing was just a favorite slide of mine from Lars Lieber about, sunrise in the San Luis Valley. And again, that message of hope and optimism going forward. The sun will come up tomorrow, and as a community, collaboratively, we'll figure this out. Other generations, you've heard people talk about compact administration. Prior to 1969, my dad and my grandfather didn't have to try to operate their farms under compact curtailment, and in 1969, they had a change in their paradigm and said, now you have to there's a little less water. I'm sure at the time it felt like it was rather insurmountable to figure out how are we going to survive under those conditions. They figured it out. This is the new generation's shift or paradigm that goes, now you got to figure out how to make your supply match your demand, recover aquifers, and replace stream depletion. So I'm confident the constituents I deal with will figure this out. There's a future for us here, and for my son. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you.